At the beginning of chapter 9, Victor is plagued with guilt. Do you feel sympathy for him? Well, he's certainly suffering. His brother William dead, and now the equally innocent Justine. He's begun to realise the impact of his actions, the ruin and devastation they've caused. Not just to the lives of those around him, but interestingly to his perception of his own life. He says, I had begun life with benevolent intentions and thirsted for the moment when I should put them into practice and make myself useful to my fellow beings. Now, I know this is the kind of introspection we've come to expect from Victor, but to be fair though, at least he's sad because he wanted to achieve something positive with his life. But as far as we can see at the moment, he's stuffed it up. His life is over from his perspective. He says, now all was blasted. Instead of that serenity of conscience which allowed me to look back upon the past with self-satisfaction, and from thence to gather promise of new hopes, I was seized by remorse and the sense of guilt, which hurried me away to a hell of intense tortures such as no language can describe. The blasted image is an image that takes us back to chapter 2, of course, when Victor sees the tree struck by lightning, an image that will inspire him to experiment with the creative powers of electricity, but also act as a metaphor for his life. Let's look back at his description in chapter 2. As I stood at the door, on a sudden I beheld a stream of fire issue from an old and beautiful oak, which stood about 20 yards from our house, and so soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared and nothing remained but a blasted stump. When we visited it the next morning, we found the tree shattered in a singular manner. It was not splintered by the shock, but entirely reduced to thin ribbons of wood. I never beheld anything so utterly destroyed. He's talking about himself, ultimately. He doesn't realise it, but that's the foreshadowing that Shelley is using here. She returns to the word blasted in chapter 9, and then again in chapter 19, when Victor declares, I am a blasted tree. The bolt has entered my soul, and I felt then that I should survive to exhibit what I shall soon cease to be, a miserable spectacle of wrecked humanity, pitiable to others and intolerable to myself. If you're writing about how Victor sees himself and the consequences of his actions, you'd impress an examiner by linking these moments, demonstrating how this image is one that Shelley has deliberately woven through the text. Let's go back to the first page of chapter 9 and find some close language analysis we can use if we're writing about this section of the text. Firstly, you could explore the Gothic features of Victor's narration here. Look at his references to the supernatural when he speaks of wandering like an evil spirit, and his guilt which hurried him away to a hell of intense tortures which no language can describe. The Gothic elements here seem to be used by Shelley to highlight Victor's psychological trauma, and to hint at the extent to which his actions have detached him and isolated him from the real world, when he says, I shunned the face of man, all sound of joy or complacency was torture to me, the solitude was my only consolation. Deep, dark, death-like solitude. The list of 3 here and the alliteration emphasise the utter desperation that Victor feels. In creating the monster, he has committed a form of spiritual suicide, it seems. Although the rest of his family is grieving, Alphonse and Elizabeth, for instance, struggle to understand the depths of Victor's despair. There's more dramatic irony in that we can see why Victor is so disturbed, but others are left questioning his sanity. He is genuinely suffering, though. The sense of spiritual suicide leads to a consideration of actual suicide when he rows out into the middle of the lake and says, I was tempted to plunge into the silent lake, that the waters might close over me and my calamities forever. It's kind of ironic, of course, that Victor seems to be focusing on giving up his life and embracing death at this point, when only a few chapters ago he was gathering up dead body parts with the intention of infusing them with life. As a romantic writer, you'd expect Shelley to focus on despair, depression and suicide, but also on the restorative and healing powers of the natural world. And she doesn't disappoint. As Victor declares, "The weight upon my spirit was sensibly lightened as I plunged yet deeper in the ravine of Arve." Immense mountains, ruined castles and fertile fields seemed to invigorate his soul and relieve his melancholy in a way that could only really happen to a romantic character in a novel wandering through Europe in the 19th century. Victor uses nature as a form of escapism. The personified natural world seems to provide him with a sense of reliable permanency, something unaffected by his own actions within time. Listen to what he says. "The very winds whispered in soothing accents, and maternal nature bade me weep no more. Then again, the kindly influence ceased to act. I found myself fettered again to grief and indulging in all the misery of reflection." Notice the desire to seek refuge and comfort in nature rather than in people. Is this the reason why there's so much personification here? It's as if the wind and the mountains and the rivers have become his new friends, eternal, reliable and non-judgmental perhaps. As he starts to reflect on events though, he becomes chained, bound by the consequences of his actions, fettered. Ultimately, he can't escape. The monster will return in chapter 10.